Hi, I'm Mike Lyndon. I'm a visual effects artist, and I'm going to be showing you some interesting stuff today in herding rocks, procedural animation in a game called Shape of the World. Shape of the World is pretty cool. You can learn more about it at the website or follow the creator on Twitter. So this game is a breather from your typical AAA title. The purpose is to explore and find joy in discovery. As you move through the world, it forms around you. It's always shifting and can be totally different when you pass through the same area a second time, allowing you to repeat that process of being lost and then discovering something new. In addition to bringing about the wonder of discovery and exploration, it's an attempt to bring relaxation and joy to games rather than combats and points. So no enemies, only discoveries. And it's creating that enjoyable feeling of being lost in a safe way, like being lost in a public park rather than in a dangerous wild. I was asked to help with creating an animation for one of the structures in the game, a monument that would be built from hundreds of rocks rising up out of the ground and moving to their final resting position. Because there were so many rocks, we thought it would be better to come up with a procedural solution to animating them rather than trying to keyframe each rock individually. As with most creative processes, the road to success has a couple of speed bumps along the way. I'm going to be showing you some of the failed attempts because I still think there's some good techniques that are worth sharing. And finally, I'll show you how we built this up by layering various procedural animations on top of a simple simulation. So the initial idea was to have the rocks basically rise up out of the ground, crawl along the surface, and then up along the structure and snap into place. And when Stu and I had a chat about this, we needed something that was a blend between a rigid body simulation to handle the interactions between the rocks and the surface of the monument, and some custom controls for how the pieces would move, giving them the ability to make decisions depending on the context. I want to chat briefly about the way that I approach something like this, because essentially this is just a bunch of pieces which have information about their position, rotation, and possibly their size. So this is what the final asset might look like. But underneath all of this, we have a number of points, and when I'm thinking about how to work with this, I'm more interested in the points because it's pretty easy for me to iterate over them and modify their properties, as opposed to thinking of each rock individually and what it might be doing at any given time. I can come up with general rules that they can all follow and use that information to adapt to their current situation. Because it's just points as the underlying data, this might be what we see, but since I have info about translation, rotation, and possibly size, I can swap those pieces out for anything. I could make them into rubber toys. I could have pig heads on there with their orientation and size. Or they could even be sheep. So when I'm approaching a problem, it's less about the final object and more about the underlying data which I can use to make those changes. Here's a very simple example of how to create a feedback loop to drive a rigid body simulation. What you're looking at is a ball that is being affected by gravity, but when the ball is below zero in the y-axis, I give it a force in an upward direction. In the bottom left, you can see the basic setup inside the DOP network. I have two solvers, one for the rigid body simulation and one to fetch the current frame's geometry, analyze it, and modify it if necessary. In the bottom right, we jump up a level outside of the rigid body sim, where I'm grabbing the current frame's data and feeding that into a point wrangle. That point wrangle has a single line of code, which you can see in the top right. If the ball is below zero in the y-axis, set the force of the ball to 10,000 units in an upward direction. This way, I get the interactions of a rigid body simulation combined with the direction over where I want the ball to go. The first thing that I came up with as an idea was, what if we create a path for each one of these objects which would update every frame so that the object would know where it needed to get to eventually, while at the same time being able to adjust its path if there was a rock in front of it. I did this by looping through each rock and creating a curve that would start at its current position and end at its final destination. Then I would distort that curve with a race op to go around any other rocks that might be obstacles. You can see that more clearly in some of the paths on the far right, where they move up and over other rocks. It wasn't a bad attempt because it allowed me to have a rigid body simulation where pieces bump into each other, but at the same time they would adjust their direction to their final goal according to the other rocks around them. Unfortunately, some pieces would never get to where they needed to be, unless I started adding more complexity to the logic of the system. The one thing that did seem to work nicely was this idea of them snapping into place at the end. You can think of it like a tractor beam that would grab hold of a rock when it was near enough to its final destination and snap it into position and correct for the orientation. So there was something there, but it wasn't a complete solution. So we had to look for other ways to achieve a similar look. The next thing that we tried is a traditional simulation of the rocks falling down and then playing that in reverse. And Stu had mentioned this in one of our initial conversations as to how we might tackle this problem. But I got caught up in the romance of a complex solution to a tricky problem. So I did a very quick test, and this is what I got out of it. I set a max speed and rotation to counter the gravity of the simulation, so that when I played it back, it wasn't as noticeable that this was being reversed. And as a first attempt, it showed potential, but we needed to break it up into stages and add that layer of control that would allow us to direct the path of the rocks a bit better. I would take this section, and playing the simulation of the pieces being affected by gravity, I would need to force the pieces outwards so they could tumble down the side. And then as soon as they started falling, I would then want to add a force to push them back towards the surface, because otherwise they would bump and bounce away from the monument. And remember, I want to play this in reverse so that it appears as if the rocks are crawling up the side rather than flying up to their final position. And I think I was heading in the right direction. You can see here that I'm giving them a force which pushes them outwards, and as soon as they pass a certain threshold, then it starts giving it a force toward the surface to kind of just help them along. So we've still got all the traditional rigid body simulation stuff happening. There's still gravity taking effect on it, but I'm adding to that with some logic that adds a force to keep the rocks close to the surface. This is what it looked like when we reversed the animation. We were a lot happier with it. We were getting the sense that the rocks were crawling up the side of the monument, but the one thing that we weren't too happy with was the movement into the final position. It was a little too floaty, and sometimes the rocks were too far away from the surface. I needed to have more control over where they were, and at the same time, I wanted them to snap into their final position. And because I was playing this backwards, it was tricky to have it reverse snap. So we thought maybe what we should just do at this point is actually just hand animate it. Because we were pretty close to what we wanted, maybe we just needed to bake out the curves and manually adjust their position and timing. Stu had also pointed out that even though this looked pretty cool, we'd moved away from the style of the rest of the game. So back to the drawing board one more time to find something that would work. We had this idea of, instead of having the pieces slide up the surface, what if they floated up to roughly where they needed to be and then snapped into position? So it was almost like they would have waypoints, and that's how I imagined this when I set this up. The rock would start in position A, it would then move to position B, and when it got there, it would then move to position C. So a much simpler setup that would allow me to have a lot more control over it and match more closely with other aspects of the game. Setting up the waypoints was pretty easy. I would spread the objects out, duplicate them, move them down, spread them out, and when I merged that with the original positions, we would have the 3 points essentially. So start position, second position, and end position. Just like keyframes describing an animation, each point knew where it needed to be in the process. This was the first look, and the great thing was it was completely procedural in that I had written some simple expressions that moved each piece almost as if it was in a particle simulation. I'll get to that code a bit later. For each rock, start moving at a specified frame towards waypoint B, and then move to point C. And it was really quick for me to change the timing, how quickly they hit their keyframes, when they started based on a couple of values. Instead of having to deal with the multiple animation curves in a curve editor, we removed the effects of a rigid body simulation, but now it was more about getting the feel right, which was more important than physically correct interactions. So this wasn't too bad, but the one thing that Stu pointed out was that everything was a little too even in the timing of the rocks. There was an even cadence to when the rocks would hit their final position, and he wanted some grouping of the rocks so that there was more variety in the visuals as well as the timing. And the reason that it looked like that is because on the left you can see that's the way I set it up. The start frame for each piece was basically from top down. So the piece at the top would start rising up first, and then subsequent lower rocks would start rising up. And what I wanted was something more like what we see on the right, which is to cluster 3 or 4 pieces together to all start roughly at the same time, so that when they did rise up, we saw these distinct groupings of the rocks. So I grouped the rocks together with their neighbors using a second set of points as reference. Each rock would inherit a number from the reference points that put the rocks into the different groups. The image on the left is the height down method, and the image on the right is using clustering. And this is the result. The rocks rise up in groups, creating a more interesting look. I now had a basic animation, kind of like my blocking phase, and I could start layering some more interesting animation and timing on top of this base layer. The first thing that I wanted to do was some easing. This is a classic animation technique of playing with the curves, even though I don't have any curves, so that each rock eases into their waypoints. It feels more polished, and the great thing was I could do this procedurally. I checked how far the object was from its waypoint, and as it got closer I would slow it down until eventually it would come to a stop. So I'm decreasing the speed a little more each frame until it reaches that waypoint. I did the same thing getting into the final position to get that snap. I already had the animation from position B to position C. What I wanted to do was essentially ramp that. So taking the existing animation, I can use a power curve with a lerp to modify how each rock animates from floating to slamming into the final position. So just to give you an idea of what the code for that looks like, here's your obligatory slide of code. It's broken into 3 parts. Phase 0 deals with moving the rocks up to waypoint B. Phase 1 starts a counter that remembers how long the rock has been floating for, and once it reaches the limit I've set, in this case 15 frames, Phase 2 kicks in, where I lerp between the 2 positions with a power function to ease out and hit hard into that final position. Now that we've got the basic animation, I want to layer the other aspects of the animation on top of this, so what I did is I gave each rock a random axis, and then I rotated each one based on a sine wave. So it would rotate in one direction, and then back in the other direction, and I could play with how fast they rotated and also how much each one rotated using a couple of parameters. I can also do the same thing for the position. I used a noise function to drive the position of the rocks based on time rather than their position in space. This gave each rock a unique drift movement. I could change how far they moved, and I could change how quickly they moved by playing with a couple of inputs. I can then take this and layer it on top of the basic animation non-destructively. When we have the two together, we have a nice soft drifting, rotating animation, which is going to add the second layer to the overall look. So this is the basic animation, again, without any of the extra layered animation, just the easing into position. Here I've added the drift. This alone has added some nice variation to what was otherwise a pretty boring animation. And then I've also added the rotation. So we've got the original animation, the drifting translation, and a little bit of rotation that combines to give a nice organic feel to the overall look. One other thing we needed to do was that we didn't want the rocks to intersect with the walkway or the player. So to avoid that, we created a force field around the walkway using metaballs and the magnet node, which pushes the rocks away when they get too close. Here you can see the nodes being used for the different portions of the animation. I could have probably combined most of these into one node, but this allowed me to very quickly isolate each part and tune it without being distracted by other portions of the animation. And this is the final result in the game from the player's perspective. We brought the monument animation into UE4 using 4 separate skeletal meshes. Each one was triggered by a different volume as the player climbed higher up the walkway. Thank you for watching. I hope you found something of use. Go check out the game, and if you have any questions, I'd love to hear from you.